Hey guys, thanks for joining me again. I am back for the next video in my hand-in-hand watercolor series, and we have talked about supplies and we've talked about thinking ahead and doing some pre-planning for your project. And in this video we're going to actually get started and doing some painting. So I'm going to be working on the lady from the set, and I'm going to be creating kind of a warm look on her like we talked about. Her jacket is going to be red, but we're going to add some warm highlights over on the light side of the image. You can see I have my value sketch here that I talked about in the previous video, and I already had decided that my light source is kind of coming from this direction, and so we're going to have light areas over on this side and shadowed areas over here. So we're just going to kind of try to keep that in mind as we go along. So I am using my Mission Gold watercolor set. I have my image stamped onto a 110-pound cold press Arches paper, and it's stamped in kind of a medium gray, light gray color. The colors of ink that I used is a little bit darker than what I would typically use for doing a no-line watercolor technique, but I wanted it to show up really nice for you. I didn't know if the super light gray that I usually like to use would show up very well in the video, so it is a little bit darker lines than what I would normally use. So we're going to get started here. You can see I was just painting with some water to start off because I'm going to start with kind of a wet on wet technique over here on the right side of her jacket, where we're going to try to get some of that warm sunny glow. So I'm dropping in some yellow now to that wet area. For wet on wet, you just start by painting with some water. You don't want like puddles of water, but you want it to be nice and wet. So I dropped in a little bit of a yellow. That's a permanent yellow is the color that I'm using there. And then I'm going to start dropping in some of the red that we're going to be going for some deeper tones as we go across. So I dropped in some yellow up here on her shoulder, and then also down here where her dress kind of flares out, thinking that the sun might kind of catch that area as well. And then I'm just going to be working with that permanent red into this drier area. And you can see I'm not getting her hood. I'm leaving her hood just unpainted for now. We'll finish that a little bit later. And you can see I'm going for more concentrated color as I work over to this dry area. And also when I get over here, I'm going to be leaving some white areas. So I'm not going to be totally filling this area in because I want to mimic the look of kind of folds in the fabric. And so you can see I'm working my brush strokes kind of this way and in a kind of a curved motion. So I want to try to capture the movement of the fabric. So don't worry if your colors are not as dark as you want them to be right off the bat. You can always go back and add more color. You can add layers of color and to reach the intensity that you want with your watercolors. So I'm going to go in here and just make sure that my edges are all nice and clean. And then I'm going to pull some of this color down here on her arm as well. Okay, and then I will go in and finish the other arm too, over here on this side. This is of course the darker side of her, so I might pull in a little bit of color here. It's called light red, which is actually darker than the other red that I'm using. It's a little bit too orange. I'm going to pull in a little bit of like a plum, a little bit of purple here. Because sometimes red can kind of take on some purple in the shadows. And I'm going to add a little bit of, drop in a little bit of this purple over here also in those more shadowed areas. And once again, I'm kind of working my brush strokes, kind of trying to stay with that concept of the fabric flowing. So we have a lot of color kind of going on in here, which I really like. I think using a lot of color in your images, rather than just shades of a single color, can really help just liven up your images. So don't be afraid to kind of play around with some different colors within an image to kind of add some life. Alright, so I'm going to leave that as is for now. We'll probably come back and add a little bit of more shading, but I want to let it dry for now, so we'll come back to that. We're going to move on to the boots. We're going to kind of make the boots, they're going to be black, but black is never really black. Black can take on a lot of different colors and reflections and that sort of thing. So I'm going to start out actually with a dark blue. This color is not part of my Mission Gold set. It's a Daniel Smith color. It's actually Mayan Blue Genuine is the name of the color. It's really good for denim. It's good for highlights on black. It's just a really pretty deep blue color. So I'm going to start off with that, and you can see I left a white area down the back side of the boot. I just want to leave that as kind of a highlight. And then I'm going to go in and I'm going to drop some deeper color. I have some Payne's Gray, which is it's probably one of my favorite colors. It is not from my Mission Gold set. This one's a Winsor & Newton color, Payne's Gray. It's kind of a blue-gray. It's one of those colors that's really hard to mix, but it's good for a lot of different things, and so I really like having it in my collection. So you can see I'm just dropping in some darker color there on what would be the shadowed side of the boot. And we might actually come back and darken that up even more a little bit later once it's dry. It's still looking pretty blue, so I might come back and darken it a little more. Because we do want it to look black, but we want it to have some interest as well. We don't want it to just be solid black. So I'm going to move on to the other boot. Actually, didn't really want that to be wet on wet. I was not paying attention to what I was doing, and I just kind of started painting with some water, which isn't really what I was going for there. So I'll just blot that out and start over, which works. And once again, I'm going to try to leave a little highlight there on the back side of the boot. And when you're doing that, if you're trying to leave a highlight and you end up going over it later, don't get too worked up about it. You can always go back once it's dry and just take a white pen, like a gel pen, and add some highlights that way as well. So I'm adding some of that Payne's Gray to add some shading. And once again, it's a little lighter than I want, but I'm going to let it dry for now, and we'll come back to it a little bit later. So I'm going to go back up to her dress and add a little bit more shading to her dress. And I'm going to start on this shadow side, and I'm using purple. Just going to add right under where the hood is there, where her hood falls on her shoulder, might be casting kind of a shadow. So I started by painting just a little bit of that purple, and now I'm cleaning. I cleaned and dried my brush, and then I'm going to go back and blend out those edges and just kind of shade that way. Once again, same technique. Apply some color and then go back with a dry brush and blend it out. Might add a little bit more shading over here on this side of her dress also. And that got really dark, so I'm going to go in here and see if I can blend that out. I'm just adding a little bit of shading to this area here where we want those fabric folds. And then I'm going to add some shading here on kind of where her arm meets her body, just to define that area a little bit. And then just blending that out. Okay, so I think that's pretty good. We're going to finish her hood, and I'm going to use kind of the same technique I used on the main part of her dress. I'm going to paint with water over here in this area a little bit, so that I'm going to add some of that sunshiny yellow again, and then my reds, and let those colors blend over here in the wet on wet. And then once again, I'm going to make sure that I'm just leaving some highlighted areas to capture the look of the folds in the fabric. And I'm thinking about here where the shadows would be, down here, kind of on that underside of her hood. Adding some purple into those darker areas. Okay, and then I'm going to go down and I'm going to work on her boots a little bit more, and I'm going to darken those up a little bit. I'm going to be using some indigo paint. This is from the Mission Gold set. It's included in that set. It's kind of, the indigo is a really pretty and pretty useful color as well. It's kind of a neutral, not quite black, has a bluish tint to it. It's great for shading. And I might just go ahead and add just a little bit of black in there, real black here. Just because I do want that shadowed area to be really nice and dark. Okay, that's better. I'm going to let that dry before I work on the other boot and also her legs. So I think we'll go up and we'll work on her hair a little bit. So hair can be a little bit tricky, I think. I'm going to work with some shades of yellow, kind of golden. This is yellow ochre, and then also some browns. And once again, you want to think about where the light is hitting her on her head. So we're going to go for the lightest areas here. And then work towards some darker areas. And once again, don't be afraid to leave some white areas just to act as highlights and just to give your image a little bit of life, and so it's not all just color, solid, solid color. Get these little tendrils in her neck area here. And then I'm going to let that dry. I'm going to go back and add some details and a little bit of shading later to define the bun and that sort of thing a little bit later, but I want to let that dry. Otherwise it's just going to all flow together. Alright, so let's work on her other boot. Let's finish that up. Should be dry enough. Go back in here with some indigo. And I added some color, and now I'm just going to go with a drier brush and just kind of blend those edges, and get some really darkness down here where the other boot is kind of in front of it. Alright, so that's better, and we still have kind of a highlighted area down the back to kind of look like a reflection. So let's go ahead and we're going to do her hand a minute before we move on to finish her hair. That's maybe not quite dry, and her legs. So flesh tones can be a little bit tricky. I'm working with some, I believe it's burnt sienna and a little bit of yellow ochre. It's a very small area, so it's not too it's not going to stand out too much if your skin tone is not exactly what you were going for. So that's pretty good. I'm going to add a little bit to her neck. Alright, now we can go and finish her legs. They should be dry. I'm going to start off with that Mayan blue again. I'm going to actually give her, instead of doing flesh tone, I'm going to give her like she's wearing jeans. Kind of a jeans leggings under her jacket here. So I'm starting off with that Mayan blue genuine color, and I'm just going to give the whole thing just a wash of color. It's pretty wet. And then I'm going to go in with some Payne's Gray and drop that in right near the top where it will be in the shadow from her jacket, and then also on the shadow side of her leg as well, while it's still wet, and then those colors just kind of blend. So we'll do the same thing with her other leg. And we'll just kind of let that blend, and I think that's pretty good for that. They kind of do their own thing. I might add a few purple strokes up here in her hood to further kind of define those folds of the fabric. And then finally, I think all we really have left is want to add a little bit of definition to her hair. And where her bun is here, I'm going to add some darker color. And then just add a few strokes. And I think that's pretty good. We're going to call that good, and we're going to move on. And in the next video, I'll be painting the man.